Madison Daniels is a visual, engaging podcaster, speaker, and storyteller who's normalising all things embarrassing in life with a candid and lighthearted personality, sharing her journey of overcoming challenges such as loss, divorce, mental health struggles, and alcoholism, while emphasising her transformative power of faith and community support. And Madison is on the line with us here. How are you today?
Hi, I'm doing great. What about you?
I'm smashing, thank you. Enjoying all this cold weather like we were talking about. Now, what was it that originally inspired you to take on this mission and kind of share your personal journey so openly?
Yeah, absolutely. So I went through really what I've kind of defined as like a couple years downward spiral in my life. And
Mm.
I went down a pretty bad path, pretty early on when I was in my teens, got really into drinking, trying drugs, and really spent my entire decade of my 20s, beginning of my adult life, just consumed with addiction, just drinking all the time, justifying it, saying that I'm in my party lifestyle.
Yeah.
I actually had really bad undiagnosed anxiety and depression. And instead of dealing with that, I was just suppressing it with alcohol and drugs. And then in 2020, it all kind of came to a head. And my father ended up passing away from COVID.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, and I actually was the one in the family that got COVID and then had to tell everybody, hey, I have COVID. And then my dad ends up dying from it. And so I kind of start just this really bad downward spiral because I feel like it's my fault my dad died, right? And
Yeah.
so I have this just guilt and shame and anger. And I remember it being the first time I had so much pain I couldn't drink it away. So then I start, adding drugs in because maybe that'll work, right? Maybe mixing alcohol and drugs will take away the pain, and it doesn't. So I try harder, drink more, try more drugs. I'm in this really bad spot. And at this point, I've been married for about 5 years. I got married really young.
Mm.
And my marriage had not been going well up until this point. And then I'm sure you can imagine, grief and addiction just kind of coupled with this, ended with my marriage imploding. So now I've lost my dad. I am in this really messy divorce. I lose my dog in the process of going through this divorce, a ton of friends. I get really
Wow.
depressed, really addicted, and I live in this state for about 2 years of just anger and grief and denial and just addiction. And I, at this point, have no faith. I grew up in a faith-based household and really turned my back on God during this phase of life, because in this phase of life, I'm making all these poor decisions. I'm doing all these things wrong. I'm, going against, so many things that I should be doing in life. And I think the reason my life is messed up is because God didn't deal me a good hand, right? And that's not why. It's because I've made every bad decision imaginable by 23,
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm like so angry with God. And I start to have these little moments where it starts to kind of get revealed to me that I'm an alcoholic, that,
Mm.
I'm addicted to these different drugs, that I'm really bad off in depression and anxiety. I start to have these things slowly revealed to me. And so slowly I start to kind of let God back in. I start to try to give up some of these, addictions that I have. I get into AA. I, start doing all of these things that, you're supposed to do in recovery, and my life starts to get better. And I'm like, would you look at that? I just stopped self-sabotaging and bam, things are getting better. I'm getting into faith. I'm, fully, kind of back in with God. Like I am really into, working the 12 steps and trying to make my life manageable, all these things. And my life starts to get, just miraculously better. And I get to this point where I'm kind of getting these like little pings of like, you need to start sharing about this.
Mm.
And I'm like, no, I don't want to because it's all so embarrassing, right? Like, who wants to
Yeah.
tell people, "Oh, I was addicted to alcohol and drugs. And at one point I wanted to kill myself because I was so depressed, right? Like,
Mm.
there was a large amount of just embarrassment and shame I carried around with those things. And I kind of just kept getting these reminders of like, whenever I was going through that, I felt so alone. I thought I was the only one that had experienced those things. I thought I was the only one that was that bad off. And as I've done therapy, as I've gotten into AA, I've realized there are a ton of people that are in the exact same situation I am. And those people also feel alone. And those people also feel like nobody knows it, nobody gets it, nobody's ever been through that. And so it starts to kind of like slowly, like, okay, start sharing about mental health. So then I start doing that. Then I start sharing about addiction. Then I start sharing about faith. And then slowly people start to reach out and are like, hey, I went through XYZ situation that was very similar to yours. And I was like, wait a second, is this actually like helping me and helping people? Like, what a crazy phenomenon. And so that's kind of Cliff Notes version as to kind of what I went through and then kind of how this evolved into kind of where I'm at today.
Yeah. And you mentioned about the fact that you had COVID and then your dad died of it. So, psychologically, it feels like you've caused that. And of course, when you think about it, it's not your fault, but it's easy to see how you'd think it would be. So, how did you deal with that?
I love that question. So so my dad passed away a little over 3 years ago, and it's taken all 3 of those years for me to go through all the stages of that. And by that I
Mm.
mean at first I was in denial. I remember at the beginning of this journey, I was speed dating therapists, right? Because I knew I was just emotionally and mentally not in a good place, and I knew I couldn't fix it. So I was like, I'll give therapy a try. And
Yeah.
anytime I had a good therapist, I wouldn't see them anymore because it
Mm.
made me uncomfortable. And so the first time I have this good therapist, and she's kind of trying to get into, like, do I have any guilt or shame or remorse around, what happened to my dad? And I shut down because I'm not ready to deal with it. And I'm in denial and I can't say out loud, I think it's my fault that he died.
Yeah.
And so I'm not seeing this therapist. I shut off those emotions because in my mind, they're too painful to deal with, right?
Yeah.
And then slowly just things start coming up. Like I worked in the corporate world for about 10 years. And during this time period, I had somebody reach out to me who told me that they felt responsible for their ex-husband's death. And it happened to be the anniversary of the death. And they were just not in an emotionally good place. And then, I share with them, I felt the same way, let me tell you. And then slowly, like weird things like that start happening where I'm like, wait a second, there are a lot of people out here that are just wandering around feeling responsible for people's death and they're just emotionally messed up because of it.
Mm.
And I slowly start to just admit it to the people that are close to me. But I remember whenever I was coming up on the anniversary of my dad's death, I wanted to just really get it off my chest. I was feeling really guilty about this. So I felt so stigmatized by this that I
Yeah.
had an AA group that I was in. I went to a brand new AA group that I had never been to tell them that I really wanted to drink that day because I felt like it was my fault my dad died. And I felt so stigmatized by admitting that I literally went to a random AA group that I'd never been to before because I only wanted to tell complete strangers because I felt so ashamed by that. And so I did all these just, really weird things to kind of deal with it. And then slowly one day it just kind of came to me that like, hey, a lot of people are carrying around the same amount of grief and like that needs to become a part of your share. And I was
Yeah.
like, oh, okay, interesting. So I mean, it's taken a full 3 years for, me to get to the point that I can have this conversation with you today.
Yeah.
So I would say, I remember whenever I was really going through it, everybody was like, it just takes time. And in the moment, you don't want to hear that because what you want is an instant solution. And you really have to like heal and work through the pain. I wrote a book called It's Only Embarrassing If You're Embarrassed.
Yeah.
And I originally started the book literally just as like a trauma dump. Like I had this guilt I'd been carrying around about my dad and I didn't know how to express it. So I just wrote it. And I ended up turning that into a book. And so like there's so many just different things that I had to do over literally the course of 3 years to get to the point where I could manage that pain and deal with that pain and have open and honest conversations about the pain. So
Yeah.
I think writing, I think sharing, I think realizing that you're not alone, I think all of those things that really helped me to be able to come to grips with this reality in a way that the pain didn't kill me in the process.
Yeah. How do you navigate the balance between being candid about your experiences and maintaining a lighthearted approach?
Oh, I love that question. So I kind of have maybe what they would consider like a dark sense of humor.
Mm.
Um, so real joke that my friends did not find funny is after my dad passed away and my life was spiraling, I was making all these bad decisions. I was like, well, at least the good news is I only have one parent to disappoint instead of two. That's the main thing.
Yeah.
And so I just like I think that I used humor to deal with the pain at the beginning because there was so much of it the only way I could express it was through humor. And so I
Yeah.
think for a little while that kind of became my coping mechanism. And then I realized that a lot of times, if you listen to like comedy most of the time is tragedy plus time, because bad things
Yeah.
happen, they're terrible, but then you tell about it later. And somehow it's this like story that you've gotten a lesson out of, or a funny story. So for me, a lot of it is about time. Like I have to wait until I try to share about things real time, but there are some things I don't. Like the feeling like my dad's death was my fault. I didn't share about that real time. I shared about that once I had been able to kind of come to grips with that in a way that I felt I could share it. And so I think a lot of it is time, and then a lot of it is just, I have this coping mechanism of humor that's somehow worked to my advantage in the process of telling people about my story and making it relatable. And really, I think a lot of times, you have to have a little bit of humor with this tragedy, because if you don't, it just becomes this sob story. And if you want it to be inspiring, you
Mm.
have to kind of be able to add a little bit of realism plus humor so people know, yeah, you can go through these things, but guess what? You can come out on the other side and somehow laugh about them, in the past or in the process or whatever, because you're finally able to heal.
Yeah. And how do you decide what aspects of your life that you're gonna share? Are there any issues that you maybe don't feel comfortable talking about, or is it all out there now?
Yeah, I love this question too. So, um, the only things I don't share are the things that are not mine to share. And by
Mm.
that I mean that whenever I was writing my book, my sister went through a really messy divorce the same time that I did. I had this whole chapter of my book that was basically about how, like, my viewpoint of, her divorce, how it impacted, myself and the family. And, my mom kind of politely reminded me that if I want to share my story, that's fine, but it's not my decision to choose to share other people's stories. And if they want to share that, then that's on them. And if I want to share, that's on me. And so I would say that's kind of my biggest lesson is, just trying to learn how to share things that are not going to piss other people off in the process, or things that are not going to make other people uncomfortable or ruin relationships. And that's hard because I'm totally an oversharer. And so sometimes
Yeah.
like I have to I'll like record a podcast and I'll be like, damn, I shouldn't have told, all of that. Maybe I need to go back and kind of, delete some of that. Um,
Mm.
and so I would say that that's really the main thing is like, am I sharing what is mine to share, or am I taking other people's and sharing about that because it feels good for me, or because, I can't believe this happened, or, whatever that looks like.
Yeah. Now, how have your experiences in recovery, both like from alcoholism and mental health, influenced your overall perspective on life?
Yeah, it's been really good for me.
Mm.
So it's so funny. I've judged people for being in all the situations that I've ended up in. And so whenever I was growing up, my dad really struggled with mental health and with alcoholism, and I judged him so harshly for those things. And then I later struggled with those, exact same things.
Yeah.
And I realized like I have, you always judge people based on the options you think they have, not based on the life that they're actually living. And
Yeah.
so I've had just so many like candid moments of being in situations. And it's almost like God like pops in to be like, remember when you judge somebody for being in the situation? See how easily you ended up in this situation.
Mm.
And so there have been a lot of really good reminders just along the way of how, really just kind of fragile life is, and how easily you can make wrong decisions or go down the wrong path, different things like that, that, from the outside looking in, it seems like, how the heck did you get yourself into that situation? And then you end up there and you're like, oh, it wasn't that hard actually.
Yeah. And when you were kind of going through all these difficult challenges, what was it that ultimately, what were you thinking at the time? Were you thinking that you will get out of it, or, I guess, were you optimistic or were you pessimistic?
Yeah, so I would say it was not until I let go of the alcohol and all the drugs that I finally started to be able to see that optimistic, because
Mm.
whenever you're really badly stuck in addiction, it's all that consumes your mind. I was actually talking to my mom about this the other day, and I was like, I remember like holiday weekends, like it would literally be like, okay, I have to go to the liquor store, the ABC store, meet this person for drugs, meet this person for drugs, make sure I
Mm.
have enough. Things are going to be closed. Like it's like this wild like thing that goes on in your mind, and so you literally have to kind of survive the day when you're in that. And so it's so hard to be optimistic. And up until I was really bad in that addiction, I was always an optimistic person. Then I get in this really bad depression. I think it's never going to end. And then I start to, get back into faith. I give up the alcohol, give up the drugs. And slowly I'm like, oh, wow, wait a second. Is this feeling that I'm feeling happiness? Like, I haven't felt this in so long. Like, do we think that this is because we got faith and gave up the alcohol and drugs? Maybe so.
Yeah.
And so it's a long process. And I would say in the moment, I really, really struggled to be optimistic. I was probably more in the pessimistic mindset. But then once I gave up the addiction and, just gave into faith a little bit, the optimism started coming more and more and more and more until finally that consumed me rather than the pessimism.
Yeah. And you're involved in the AA community. You've kind of been involved in it. So, what role did that play in your recovery, and what impact does it maybe still have on you now?
Yeah, I love that question. So, whenever I first went to AA, I was so angry about going to AA. And just as a person, I had all this
Yeah.
anger, this resentment. I, was ashamed that I needed to go to AA. And kind of the backstory is I quit drinking for about 3, 4 months before I went to AA. And all I thought about every day after I quit was drinking. I wanted to drink all the time. And I finally ended up going to AA because my therapist had been telling me I needed to go. And I started going to AA on a Wednesday. If you're wondering like what sort of alcoholic I was, like it wasn't
Yeah.
even like a Saturday night, like on a Wednesday.
Yeah.
Um, I actually I'm working in the corporate world at the time, so I have to, back out of this dinner that I'm supposed to kind of be hosting because I can't go and not drink, right? So I have to tell my boss, like, hey, I can't go to this event tonight because I'm actually an alcoholic, and if I go, I'm going to drink, I'm going to ruin my life. And nobody questions you when you say things like that. They're just like, yeah, it sounds like you shouldn't go, right? So I go to AA that night, and the whole way there, I'm so angry. And I'm like, you want to know what? If my dad hadn't, drank so much when I was growing up, I wouldn't be in this situation. If, God had just made it so I didn't have an addictive personality, I wouldn't be in this situation. I'm angry, I'm blaming, I'm the victim, I'm not taking accountability. And I get to AA and I'm like, I could just not go in. Like, I could literally leave now. Nobody would know that I even came or like was even one of
Mm.
those people that needed AA. Like, that's what I'm thinking, right? And so I say a quick little prayer. I'm like, hey, God, if you want me to be, in this AA thing, like, show me tonight. Go into the meeting. I'm still like debating, like, I could leave and like no one would know that I was here. And in the
Yeah.
process of this battle, the meeting starts. And I'm like, well, we're in now,
Yeah.
and I literally sit in the back of this meeting and cry almost the whole meeting because I was just so touched and shocked by every single thing that was shared because I had never been in like recovery or treatment. I had never been around this many people that could relate to what I had been through and that
Yeah.
were sharing about it in a way that was open. And these people had gotten through it. I remember I was there and this woman was there. She had 12 years of sobriety and she shared about how since she'd been in the program, she's lost her son, she's lost her mother, and she's lost her father, and she hasn't taken a drink during any of those events. And I was like, okay, God, I get it. This is where I'm supposed to be. Um, so I, get really into the program. I'm going, to AA all the time. I'm reading the book. I'm working the steps. I'm doing all the things. And then a couple months ago, was in the process of chairing the meeting. So there's always a person that kind of chairs or leads the meeting. So
Yeah.
that's my point that I'm, starting to chair the meetings. And I have this like really great reminder of like the stigma people feel when they first come into the rooms. Because by
Mm.
this point, I am very open about my journey. I have a podcast I'm sharing about it. I chair meetings. Like I'll tell people anything about my drug and alcohol addiction. Like I'm not ashamed of it anymore. But
Yeah.
I'm hearing these meetings and I kind of forgot about these moments of shame. And there is this new guy who comes to a meeting and he's like, we kind of open the meeting up for just whatever people want to talk about before it starts. And so this guy, he shares and he's like, hey, I have something really controversial I want to ask you guys and talk about. And it's going on kind of this long pitch about whatever it is he wants to talk about. And I'm like, okay, this is not really how these meetings go. Like, I don't know what I'm going to say to this guy. I don't know what his question is. And it turns out his question was that he struggled with alcohol and drug use. And he wanted to know if he could talk about both because we're in AA, but he really struggled with both and he really needed to get some issues both his chest. And I'm like, that's what you thought was controversial? Like, I didn't say that, but that's what I'm thinking. Like, we're in AA. Talk about all the alcohol and drugs you want. Like, we do not care, sir. And so he gets done and it's kind of quiet. And I'm like, oh, this guy's waiting for me to answer, right? Because I'm during the meeting. And so I'm like, oh, yeah, like I personally struggled with alcohol and drugs. I think most people in here did. We don't
Hmm.
really care. So, like, if you need to share about alcohol, drugs, whatever, like, we don't care. That's what we're here for. And it was this great reminder that I was where that guy was, but I was afraid to even ask that question, you know? And it's always such a good reminder that whenever chair meetings, you go to meetings that even if you're in a good place, not everybody there is. And it was just like such this humbling moment of like, wow, I'm not in that place anymore that this guy is in now, but I have the opportunity to help somebody who is in a place that I once was. So kind of full circle from start of AA to now, kind of how the program has impacted me.
Absolutely. And you mentioned your podcast there. So, what message do you hope your podcast sends to those who may be going through similar challenges that you have?
So the title is only embarrassing if you're embarrassed. I kind of decided upon because
Mm.
I realized, in my 20s, I had struggled with addiction, grief, loss, divorce, all these things that people could be embarrassed about. But
Yeah.
ultimately, you determine embarrassment. Like you're the one that's embarrassed. So if you choose to be embarrassed about that, it's going to be an embarrassing event. But
Yeah.
you can choose to not be embarrassed about that, and you can choose to just accept that that's a part of your story, and that not all of your story is going to be picture perfect. And so, really, it's all about just being genuine, authentic, just being honest and open. So people have a platform where they can just hear things maybe they haven't heard somebody talk about before. They can realize they're not alone, and they can realize like they choose what they're embarrassed or what they're ashamed of. How other people don't get to choose that for you.
Absolutely. Well, what's coming up in the not too distant future? What kind of things are you going to be talking about on the podcast and any other projects that you may be working on?
Yeah, I love it. So I just launched my first book. It's only embarrassing if you're embarrassed. So I'm going to be doing some different things kind of around that book. I'm going to be doing some giveaways, things like that. And then I am also going to be on the podcast. I do an episode called Faith Friday, and I'm trying to read the whole Bible through this year. So we're going to unpack that on every Friday's episode, just kind of whatever lessons I'm learning as we're, trying to read the Bible through in a year. And that's kind of a new segment that I've added where I try to talk about the Bible in a way that's easy and digestible and makes sense and really back to, just everyday life. Also have a lot of mental health things coming up on the podcast, talking about imposter syndrome,
Ooh.
talking about what to do if you're not sure if you need to start getting a therapist, difference between going to see a therapist and a psychiatrist. I'm trying to make it really practical takeaways where you can listen, you can get information, and you can also have like, next steps if that topic feels like it was really speaking to you.
Absolutely. Well, where are we able to find the podcast and the book and keep up to date with you everywhere?
Yeah, I love it. So it's only embarrassing if you're embarrassed. You can find the book on Amazon, podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And I have an Instagram account, Your Internet Bestie Mads. And there is where you can find like more like everyday life that I'm sharing. So kind of depending if you're like more podcast book, everyday life, that's where you can kind of find the things of Madison.
Excellent. Well, many thanks for talking to us today. It's been great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and hope you have a great day.